Anthony Albanese on Tuesday was sworn in for his second term as Prime Minister, along with his new cabinet. And what got everybody talking was the absence of a Bible when he took his oath. The Catholic Prime Minister, rather than swearing on a Bible, as is tradition, chose to take a secular affirmation. Here's what he did on Tuesday.
Please read the affirmation.
I, Anthony Norman Albanese, do solemnly and sincerely affirm and declare that I will well and truly serve the Commonwealth of Australia, her land and her people in the office of Prime Minister.
Congratulations, Prime Minister. Prime Minister. Well done.
Now, legally, it makes no difference, but politically and culturally, there's questions being asked, particularly since Anthony Albanese made a pretty big deal of his Catholic faith prior to the election, and more recently was talking about how proud his mother would be that he will be the first Australian Prime Minister to attend the inauguration of a Pope. So why didn't he swear his oath on the Bible? He is, as I said, a Catholic. Well, here's the explanation he gave today.
I believe in a separation of church and state, so I choose, for example, today I've always chosen to do an affirmation because I think that as the Australian Prime Minister, you know, I represent people of every faith and no faith. And so that for me, that's a personal decision. Other people who swear on the Bible or the Quran, in Anne Ali's case, is perfectly up to them. It's a personal choice. But
now, there's a few points we could make about this, but let me just make one point. He said he refused to swear on the Bible because he believes in the principle of the separation of church and state. Here's my question. Where did he get that principle from? Well, that principle was non-existent until Jesus said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. The principle of separation of church and state, religion and state, did not exist anywhere in the world until Jesus made that claim. That principle, which he says was his guiding principle, is actually in the Bible that he refused to swear on. Albanese probably just doesn't know quite enough of what he believes. If he knew it, he wouldn't have had a problem.
Very well played again, although I think he is being very genuine to see. He didn't make a huge deal. I mean, the fact that the Pope died in the middle of the election campaign, obviously he had to put out a statement about that and comment on it a lot. It emerged publicly and against, I can tell you, it was actually against his wishes. He actually asked the journo not to run the story, but the journo did anyway, and it wasn't me. But that he'd been going to Mass again, so he'd started being, and he's been raised a Catholic, obviously. You know, like we all do, you lapse, you go off and do other stuff, and then you often come back to it later in life. And he'd started doing that, and he'd been spotted at the big Catholic church in Canberra, and so that was written about, and I read that and went, woohoo, he's back. But I don't think it is something, because I actually had him on my podcast and tried to get him to talk about him going back to the faith or, you know, his own Catholicism, because it was clear that he wrote the statement about the Pope dying himself. You can just tell sometimes when it's them and not their minions doing it. And he just wouldn't talk about it. He just, even to me, who, you know, even on a podcast, it's really intimate and blah, 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 chatting away. He just sort of talks generally about the importance of the Pope and blah, blah, blah. So I think it actually is something he does like to keep quite private and considers quite personal, which I respect. The other thing, of course, is that if you're swearing an allegiance to the Australian Part, I imagine the Bible they bring out, it would be a Church of England. It would be the King James version, wouldn't it? And so, obviously, as a true Catholic, he could only swear on the Revised Standard Version. The King James version, that's a proddy Bible.
No, you could swear on the Message version.
Although you could bring in your own.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I'm not questioning Albanese's faith. His Christian faith is certainly a matter for him. But, I mean, when you swear the oath of allegiance, that's not on behalf of the Australian public. That's your promise to the highest authority that you know of that you are going to do a good job. So I still don't understand him saying, well, I represent people of all faiths and no faiths, therefore I don't swear on the Bible. But it's not about everybody else. It's about you and what you consider to be the highest authority that you can promise your fidelity to.
Yeah, and look, I hate to be sceptical about a person's religion. You never want to be sceptical. And I'm not being sceptical. If the Prime Minister is a true Catholic, as he says he is, then that's totally fine. But the problem I have with this is that the Prime Minister himself actually made this almost into an election issue when he paused campaigning on the day that the Pope died. Now, firstly, look, I've got to be honest, I think it was a bizarre decision. I don't know why you need to pause campaigning on the day that the Pope died. But to me, it seemed like it was a deliberate attempt to win over Catholic voters. Now, why do I think that this was absolutely ridiculous? Well, because he cancels campaigning on that day, and then about an hour later, he held a press conference in which he was asked about his Catholic faith at that press conference. And he said, well, I have three faiths, actually. The Labor Party, the Catholic faith and the South Sydney Rabbitohs. And that in itself sounded like a sheer slogan to me. So again, I'm not questioning that he is a Catholic, but he didn't even go to a Good Friday service, you might remember. He did not go to church on Good Friday. So if you're that devout, why didn't you go to church?
No one likes the bad news days. Everyone just wants to go to the Sunday.
No, but it doesn't matter. But Peter Dutton went. Peter Dutton went to church on Good Friday. So if you are such a devout Catholic, why didn't you go? That's the question.
Yeah, look, I don't think he is I don't think he's like a huge devout Catholic. But again, like of course you would pause
but he's made
campaigning with the Pope.
Why?
Like imagine if Queen Elizabeth had died and you'd still keep.
I personally think it's different. I think. Look, again,
it worked for him electorally, but still, it was
an electoral. But I think it was an electoral ploy. It was deliberately to win over the Catholic vote. I personally do not think you needed to pause.
But wait, if that was his agenda, right?
During the middle of an election campaign because the Pope died.
If his agenda was to win over the Catholic vote, it would make sense then for when he's on your podcast, Joe, and you ask him about his Catholic faith, not to them play it up.
No, he didn't milk it. And again, just that, because some people, the whole thing of Albo saying it was raised with three faiths, the Australian Labor Party, the Catholic Church and the South Sydney Rabbitohs, that is the oldest cliche in the book. That is him talking about his childhood and how he was raised. And he was...
It's an election slogan, but this proves
it was an election slogan.
It was all electoral.
That has been a slogan that has been around about him. It's like
but why say it on the day that the Pope died then?
It's like Superman fighting for truth, justice and the American way.
It doesn't. But why say it on the day the Pope died? If I'm going to cancel campaigning because I'm a Catholic and we need to respect this, why whip out slogans?
Because it's something that is just universally known about him and has been for his entire life.
Yeah, I'm very skeptical. I'm very skeptical.